Good morning. It's me, Pastor Sarah Rugenstone. I'm the site pastor here at our Clayton site. It's so good to see each and every one of you here with us in worship this morning. How many of you can say that you remember when Instagram came on the scene? Yeah, I can. I was a freshman in high school in 2010 when Instagram launched, and my parents wouldn't let me have this newfangled social media. Nor was I allowed to be on Facebook. I was super annoyed at the time, but now I am literally considering paying my future children to not be on social media until their whole brain is developed. But 2010 Sarah, she wasn't having it. Oh, how the world was missing out on young Sarah's pure genius because my parents wouldn't let me on the internet. A budding artist being snuffed out. Anyways, fast forward, the year is 2011. I'm a sophomore now, and I finally wore my parents down. They let me have a social media account. Finally, here was my first post. For those of you who can't read the caption, it says, super duper reindeer pooper. See, this is the thing. I wish now my parents wouldn't have allowed me to release my creative genius into the world in 2011. The world wasn't ready, and it still isn't. But today, we're continuing our conversation regarding screen time, troubleshooting our relationship with technology by focusing on how technology can both be a blessing and sometimes not so much of a blessing. So far, we've been invited into a tech Sabbath as we seek to be more mindful of the time that we spend on our devices. And last week, we chatted about the dangers present in comparison culture, which is often experienced through social medias like Instagram. And Pastor Matt provided us with an alternative understanding that we ought to ground ourselves in gratitude, focusing on the gifts that we do have, opposed to comparing ourselves to others and what we do not have. So, technology is a tool that we can use, and it is neutral. I think it's worth saying again that technology isn't inherently evil or good. It is neutral. Technology is a tool that can be used for both good and bad. And both Scripture and Jesus have a lot to say about how we ought to use whatever resources become available to us in order to create a life-affirming and positive relationships around us. One of my favorite Easter stories, and yes, it's not too late to discuss Easter, even though that was a whole 3 weeks ago, we're still celebrating in the church. That's right. It's a season of Easter. So, one of my favorite Easter stories involves two of Jesus' disciples who are deciding to skip town on what turned out to be Easter Day. Okay, so even though they'd heard reports and mumblings that the tomb was empty, they're getting out of Dodge, or in this case, Jerusalem, perhaps thinking that they were next on the hit list. So hear these words from the Gospel of Luke. On that same day, two disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. While they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. They were prevented from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" They stopped, their faces downcast. The one named Cleopas replied, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place there over the past few days?" Now, these two are on their way towards the nearby town of Emmaus, and they are quickly joined by a stranger. Now, spoiler alert, we, as the hearers of this story, know that the stranger is actually the resurrected Christ, and he asks his new traveling companions a question. "What are you talking about as you walk along?" And they stopped, their faces downcast. And then Cleopas gets really sassy and is like, "Where have you been, dude?" Jesus is like, I was there. And I don't know what types of phone they were looking at when they were causing their faces to be downcast. Or maybe they were looking at tablets. Thank you. Okay, so Sorry. Okay. But the text makes a point to emphasize this in order to show just how lost they felt. Their religious leader had just been executed. They were without Jesus' leadership and friendship again, or so they thought, since the resurrected Jesus was the one asking them this very question. But there was something interfering with these two ability to see who was with them. Maybe it was their own depression. Maybe it was their inability to look up and forward. Maybe they were the first ones in history to suffer from tech neck by looking down too much. Maybe their walking cadence resembled that of a dejected Charlie Brown. Regardless, the traveling disciples are sad and grieving. In their continuing conversation, everything is phrased in the past tense, which accumulates in the words found in verse 21 that says, "We had hoped." They don't know how to move forward. These two persons are seemingly encapsulated by the loneliness and isolation they've endured over the past 3 days. They don't remember what was promised to them just days before. The truth of where they came from was clouded by grief. Their memory of what they'd seen and been through was shaky and scattered. They're caught up in the trap of trauma, despair, isolation, loneliness. They need something, someone to shake them awake. Now, pause on that story. We're going to come back to this scene. Keep them in your pocket. Now, as people of the 21st century, we can relate to those feelings of isolation and loneliness. We can relate to the downcast looks. We can relate to not being able to recognize Christ right in front of us. We know what it is to be lost, scattered, and we know what it's like to be in a society that wants to consume us when we were made to embrace, embody, and evolve. We have a tendency to turn toward our little devices and technology to save ourselves from the overwhelming feelings of misunderstanding and loneliness. And this can lead to a certain level of passivity. And when we passively use technology is when it can become dangerous. When we aren't fully aware and present, it's far too easy to reduce people on screens to someone other. And when we start othering, we get into a really dangerous place. We all too easily forget the other humanity. We reduce people to spicy words typed on a Reddit thread. And when we allowed social media to reduce our humanity, we simply become avatars, and not the last airbender kind either, unfortunately. Couple this with the anonymity that is inherently present online, and it is a recipe for dehumanization. We feel it. We know that we are able to treat people more poorly online than in real life. There's science to back this too. Remove the face, the personhood, the actual breathing human, and people can get really mean. We have been, or at least have known people who have been on the receiving end of online judgments. One time, a long time ago in a galaxy far away, I started a new job, and I was in a meeting, and someone felt empowered to let me know that they'd looked at my social media before I came on board, my Facebook in particular, and they told me in a meeting that they didn't think that they would like me when I started. They said I looked like a basic, censored for young ears, only they didn't censor themselves. Also, as an aside, using basic beep as an insult is not creative. Essentially, this person said I look like somebody who likes coffee and fun music and tried to spin that negatively with some harsh language. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this comment that was meant to be derogatory, the term refers to a woman who likes things that a lot of other people like. I don't know. I guess women are being scrutinized for liking things now. Okay. Just let people enjoy things, even if other people like it too. It's okay. So, at that point, though, I want you to know, I only had 3 profile pictures up that they could have based their entire judgment of my persona off of. It was these. barf. Are you kidding? When I see those pics, I think, what a basic, I'm just kidding. When I see those pictures, I see someone who's really happy and who did a lot of freaking work to get there. And I think that there was the real issue for the person judging those 3 pictures of me. They were deeply unhappy with themselves. And they didn't know what to do with that. So they took to drawing their own conclusions about me, who I was, before they'd even met me. And I won't lie, that's what stung in all of this. Not what they called me, but rather that they made a decision at face value, literally a picture of my face that is not actually the embodied me. They saw a little circle on a screen, and they decided, I don't like her. They don't want to work with me. And it created a wall, a distance, and a separation. And that, to me, is often the negative side of how we use technology when we use it to distance ourselves from the humanity of others. And what's wild is the promise of technology was to bring us closer together. The promise of technology was to bring us closer together, but often we find it placing barriers between us. Or we unthinkingly put up barriers when we use it in our relationships passively. Humans are somewhat hardwired to make snap judgments and social categories for people, and sometimes technology amplifies this in a bad way because we're suddenly immersed in worlds of people right here on our phone. And we're being asked to make snap judgments of them. Do I like this person's craft? Their outfit, their food, their family, their dog? Yes, no, yes, no. We're desensitized to our authenticity, our moments of realness, our mess-ups, our ums, ers, and ahs. And what's so frustrating is that the promise of phones with internet abilities, social media, apps for whatever, all of these things were made with the promise of bringing us together, but underlying, that was marketed to us. Connection is not the goal of a capitalistic society. The goal of all of this was to be more accessible, to be more marketable, to be more how society wants us to be. The goal was never connection, but consumption. So the question becomes, how do we redeem this? It looks like actively engaging rather than passively using technology and social media, meaning not leaving an anonymous mean comment and dipping out, or not using someone's social media profile as a way of judging who they are as a whole person. It means using technologies like Zoom and FaceTime to connect with your long-distance friends, or use social media to see how your nieces and nephews out of state are growing up, and leaving sweet comments on your friends' pictures saying you miss them. I think there are very positive ways we can engage social media and technology, particularly when we come at it through a lens of engagement rather than passivity and judgment. I encourage you to make note of the times when you feel yourself judging or passively scrolling using tech, because this is where we get into trouble. This is where we start to see things and people as more as something to be consumed. And we are not products to be consumed, but things, beings made to bask in the delight of creation and relationship. Stick with me. So, one of the things that gets nestled into all types of online media services is this reality that you are there to consume or buy. It's actually a little bit freaky how advanced this is becoming. Because I bet you've had it happen to you too. If you've got a too smart for its own good phone, I'll be talking about how I need something, like a bird feeder that has a video camera, and then suddenly, without having searched anything on Google, bird feeders with cameras start popping up on my targeted ads. They're listening. They're not. Okay. So, y'all, even some of the people you follow on social media are being paid to post stuff. It's content to be consumed. So one of the questions I begin to ask myself is, what's being consumed here? Am I gorging myself on other people's curated lives? Am I eating up some cheap, unethically made product? Am I grazing through comments of mean-spiritedness? Or is it me? Am I putting myself out there to be devoured by other people's preconceived notions and judgments? We're constantly bombarded with content to judge, take in, and consume. And often we do this passively, forgetting that there's a real person, a real life, real humanity on the other side. And sometimes we can lose our own sense of humanness when we are constantly trying to curate ourselves in a way that seems acceptable to the masses. And while we're seemingly constantly connected because we've scrolled through so much content, we tend to actually not feel a sense of true connection. Loneliness is one of the products, ironically, of our near constant interconnectedness. Sometimes this is the result of being reduced to merely a thing to be marketed. Studies show that being treated as an avatar or content ourselves often results in feelings of isolation. We're caught up doing the work of processing others' judgments of ourselves, and we give it weight, maybe more than what belongs. Sometimes we can physically withdraw from our regular day-to-day life because the age-old adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. What a crock of baloney. We are designed for empathy, to form long-lasting relationships with each other. So when we feel rejected, even by anonymous strangers, the results to ourselves and those we love can be devastating to our mental, emotional, and physical health. There's actually a time in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, when Jesus is sending his disciples out in twos and instructs them that in those places where the message is being rejected, that they ought to shake the dust off of their sandals and get the heck out of Dodge. It says, if anyone refuses to welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet and as you leave that house or city. Shake it off. Taylor Swift, anyone? Thank you. Now, I'm not saying that you needn't acknowledge the harm that somebody else caused to you, but rather that we shouldn't bask in someone else's false, harmful projection of us and who we are. Shaking it off shows us that sometimes there's more wisdom in leaving once rejected than staying around and absorbing more rejection. Sometimes opting out is the biggest win. So if that app is no longer working for you, hide it, delete it, unsubscribe from it. There are certain apps that I've given up over time. Twitter is among them. My Facebook I use mostly to get to know people from church and stay connected with the older members of my family. That works for me. You can also set some set-in-stone boundaries. I'm working on some myself. I have a personal Instagram and a Pastor Sarah Instagram. Now, I could go very set in stone and just not have an Instagram. That's what Pastor Tim Ziegler, our McCausland site pastor, does. I learned this on Easter Sunday when I tagged Tim Zig on Instagram, only to learn that that was another Tim Ziegler. Not the Gathering one. Well, the real Tim Ziegler, please stand up. A boundary. And what's beautiful about a healthy boundary is that it might not make sense for others, but if that's what's working for you as you, that's what's important. In this world of constant content and consumption, we're constantly receiving messages about who we are, who we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to look like, everything. And it can be really easy to lose ourselves in that mess. Remember that we are people of authentic relationships. Remember who we came from. Listen, I love Lion King, okay? And we can all just say it. That movie will preach. I mean, chef's kiss. And if you're wondering, Sarah, why are you talking about the Lion King? It's because of an absolutely incredible scene that we're about to watch together, where Simba, in all his feels, needs a reminder. And yes, I have been waiting my entire pastoral career of 2 years to be able to work this clip into a sermon. Let's go. So here's how that preaches. Analogy. We are all like Simba, and Mufasa is like God. And pastors, I guess, are like the quirky little guy with a stick showing you all the connections. You tracking? Okay. When we forget ourselves, we forget that God is woven within our core and being. When we forget another person's personhood and embodiedness, we also forget that God is woven within them and their very being. And honestly, a lot like Cloud Mufasa, God encourages us to look again when we forget ourselves, to remind ourselves who dwells within us, to see the image of God reflected back at us. And that can be hard to do on our own, which is why we are given the gift of relationship, authentic, loving community that will remind you who you are when you forget. You are invited into the body of Christ, where we can constantly be reminded that we are God's beloved. Y'all ready for a Greek word? Here we go. Alelan, okay? This word alelan shows up 100 times over the course of 94 verses in the New Testament, and it means one another. So we can read 100 different ways in which we are meant to interact with one another. We ask questions of each other. We are instructed to love one another. In the Gospel of John, Jesus issues a commandment, and it reads, "I give you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you, so that you must love each other also. This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, when you love each other." So how we treat one another in our relationships is based on God's very own love for us. This ought to be the way in which we are able to intentionally interact with one another all of the time, online, offline, that we can be aware of one another's full humanity and sacred divine worth. We are known by this love, not by being right all the time, but instead by demonstrating the love of God for strangers, neighbors, and family alike. Technology has the ability to bring us together in amazing ways, creating new connections across time and space, unlike anything in human history. Yet it's not our salvation, and it's also not our destruction. If we were to fill out a social media profile in an attempt to describe our relationship with screens and tech, it would probably say it's complicated. Anybody remember when Facebook gave you that option for some reason? The truth is, however, we are not products to be consumed. We are loved creations of God, created in God's own image. We are image bearers. We are more than what some anonymous username says we are. And how do we remember this in a world that's hard-pressed to convince us otherwise? Well, friends, look around. We're doing it. We're gathered here together to remember who we all are together in Christ. Before there was a name for church, it was called ecclesia, which means the gathering. Sound familiar? That is where that came from. So, it was a place not just to go once a week, but it existed inside and outside of buildings, wherever two or more folks would gather together and they would see each other. They would get to know one another, and they would often share a meal together. Speaking of which, I don't want to leave you hanging about those two disciples accompanied by the risen Christ on their way to Emmaus. Let's see where they are. So, the next thing that happens is Jesus asks them this question. They don't know it's Jesus, and he's like, "All right, I'm gonna go." And they're like, "No, come stay with us." So he does, and the disciples are still in a fog. They're just being hospitable. They think they do not know this man. So when they arrive at the place where they were going, Jesus takes his seat, still unknown. He picks up the bread and he blesses it and breaks it and shares it with his friends, and immediately they see him for who he is. Immediately, the fog is lifted. Jesus' face is in front of them, and suddenly, immediately, over broken bread and a cup of wine, they remembered. And then, Jesus dips out. The text says he disappeared from their sight because the guy loves a good entrance and exit. Just this past week, the Wall Street Journal posted an article describing the mental health benefits of going to church. I saw that, and I was like, okay, did a pastor write this? But it turns out it wasn't actually a church marketing thing. It's almost like people have been doing this for thousands of years and benefit from actually being connected together in community. We feel more connected and have a deeper sense of belonging. One of the best anecdotes to this technology epidemic is to show up for one another, is to be this community for one another, in person or online, to show up as reminders and to be reminded of who you are. I know that you can all start to feel clouded and bogged down out there. And I know that this world can be heavy and harsh. And I know there are a million different things telling you who you're supposed to be. But I also know this, that here together we break bread and we share the cup. That here together the fog is lifted, and if only for a moment we see Christ in each other, and here together we remember who we are.